Imagine a situation in which a group of activists were to claim that a certain Dutch tradition is racist. Imagine that they would claim that the figure Black Pete is related to colonialism and to the transatlantic slave trade, and that the figure is therefore racist. Now, of course, every slightly decent individual agrees that racism is bad, and that if the tradition would indeed be some kind of satire of enslaved black people, it would be a problem. However, the question that should be answered first is Black Pete indeed based on enslaved black people? Now ask yourself this: what should be the role of the Dutch tax-funded state media in this situation? Well, according to the website of the Dutch tax-funded state media, they should bring news that is diligent, reliable, independent, pluriform and objective. And the Dutch media law obligates them to engage in journalism that lives up to the highest journalistic and professional standards. And in exchange they are funded with taxpayers' money. And this man is the chief editor of the Dutch tax-funded state media outlet, the man who is responsible for making sure that his organization acts in accordance with the law. So based on all of this, what should tax-funded journalists working for the Dutch state media do? Well, they should investigate the claim that the figure Black Pete is related to colonialism and to the transatlantic slave trade in order to find out if the claim is true. So they would have to dig into the tradition of Black Pete and do their research, because if you don't do research, you don't know the facts, and if you don't know the facts, you can't engage in fair reporting and you can't ask critical questions. And if you can't ask critical questions and don't engage in fair reporting, you're not a journalist, at least not according to the Dutch law. Such research would lead these journalists to first investigate the larger pagan tradition in Europe in which people paint themselves black. They would then find out that this tradition goes back thousands of years and is the result of multiple pagan religious elements. They would find out that people in Europe made their faces black and put on scary costumes in order to play the Wild Hunt, a supernatural group of demons led by a mythological figure such as the Germanic god Wodan. Journalists living up to the Dutch media law and the 3 guidelines from the Dutch Council of Journalism by engaging in an actual honest and objective research in order to find out the facts would discover that the tradition later got Christianized, which led to the Germanic wild hunt figures to become devils and the representation of Wodan to become a version of Saint Nicholas, a Christian saint. And after that, these amazingly reliable, independent and honest journalists would then quickly glance at the Dutch media law, which obligates them to engage in objective journalism, and then again take a look at the complaints from the activists and then ask themselves once more, but what about the connection to slavery? Our Dutch version of this wild hunt / devil figure is accused of being a reference toward the transatlantic slave trade, because our version of this tradition looks like a North African Moor. So let's find out the facts. These amazing journalists would then continue their very good investigation and find out that it can't have anything to do with colonialism, because also in parts of Europe that never had anything to do with colonialism, the devil figure is occasionally depicted as a North African Moor. They would then find out that this is the case because for centuries the Moors tried to conquer Europe, and that they used to raid the coasts of Europe and kidnap children and young women in order to sell them into slavery. So therefore the idea of occasionally having the devil depicted as a Moor makes sense from a historic perspective. These amazingly objective journalists would then ask themselves, but how is it possible that the Dutch version of this figure comes from Spain with a boat? They would then continue their investigation and find out that this is the case because the Moors managed to conquer Spain, which was called Al-Andalus. The reason that in the Dutch version of this tradition the Black Pete figure puts children that misbehaved in a bag in order to take them back to Spain is a reference to the Moorish slave trade of European children. In addition, these journalists would find out that if the tradition of Blackpeat had anything to do with the transatlantic slave trade or with colonialism, Sinterklaas and his army of Blackpeats would not come from Spain, but instead from one of the former Dutch colonies. In that case, the boat would, for example, come from Curaçao. Also, if this were the case, the first version of the Dutch Blackpeat wouldn't be wearing typical North African clothing, but instead would be wearing the type of clothes typically worn by slaves. They would then find out that later this outfit was changed to the clothing typically worn by 16th century Spanish noblemen, which has even less to do with colonialism because slaves didn't wear the type of expensive nobleman clothing that the average Dutchman couldn't even afford. And finally, these honest and objective journalists would find out that the tradition is also celebrated in the former Dutch colonies by actual black people, and also there the Blackpeat figure is wearing Spanish nobleman clothing and not slave clothing. So if some action group in the Netherlands were to claim that blacking up is some form of racism, which is completely nuts and detached from reality, then the Dutch tax-funded state media is obligated by law to do their research and to then create news items which are based on this research. And if some nutcase from the United Nations, who hasn't done even the slightest amount of research, accuses the Dutch people of having a racist tradition, then these journalists, whose salaries are paid by these same Dutch people that are getting accused, should respond by doing investigation and by showing the facts. However, sadly, in reality, the journalists of the Dutch tax-funded state media outlet did not act in accordance with the law. Instead, they did the exact opposite. They decided to join forces with the activists and serve as a propaganda outlet for the activists and to help them in their attacks against the Dutch tradition of Sinterklaas and Blackpeat. The Dutch state media outlet has been one of the strongest proponents of changing the Dutch tradition. Every year they even put propaganda from the activist groups in their broadcasts which are aimed towards children, enforcing the idea that the Blackpeat figure indeed has something to do with colonialism. The Dutch tax-funded state media has been trying to shift the opinion of the Dutch population in favor of changing the tradition by spreading lies and disinformation about the tradition and by refusing to do their jobs properly, even though the law obligates them to do research. Their complete unwillingness to live up to the law and to actually do their jobs properly also became very clear when the Netherlands received a visit from some mandate holder from the United Nations. The lady in question dictated that the Dutch blacking up tradition should over time disappear, and the journalists of the Dutch tax-funded state media were even present in the same room while this lady said this, and none of them even asked one critical question. Questions such as, what do you know about ancient European traditions? Why do you put Blackpeat in the context of colonialism, even though it has nothing to do with that? Or, according to our research, which of course we've done, the tradition has nothing to do with colonialism. So can you clarify why you think that we should abolish our own traditions in our own country? Zero of such questions were asked. They are breaking the law and are therefore a criminal organization, and they should be sanctioned accordingly. Misappropriation of public funds according to the law is sanctioned with 3 years in prison or a financial penalty of the 5th category. Anyway, thanks for watching and have a nice day.